It's the early 1400s, the old classics of antiquity are being dusted off, art, philosophy and the sciences are flourishing, and the Renaissance is in full swing. In Greece. While the Renaissance is of course most famous as an Italian phenomenon, what remained of the Byzantine Empire was actually experiencing a similar movement at the same time. Thanks to the fact that the Eastern Empire had never been conquered or fallen into anarchy, the writings of the ancient world remained relatively intact there, unlike in the West where much had been lost. And so, the Greek scholars who started taking an interest in these old scriptures would prove hugely influential to the Renaissance in Italy, and one of these men was Gemistus Pletho. He was born into a relatively well-off family in Constantinople around 1360, and went on to study there, as well as in the nearby Ottoman court at Adrianople, before returning home and establishing himself as a teacher of philosophy. Pletho's teaching methods varied from the mainstream of the time. Unlike today, the upper-class Byzantines usually wouldn't get educated in large classes. Instead, a tutor would take on 2 or 3 students at a time and teach them in his own home. The students would then learn to memorize and recite long passages from works on whatever subject they were learning, and this is where Pletho stands out. He believed that knowledge already existed in the soul, and that it was the teacher's responsibility to draw out that knowledge. Thus, rather than having his pupils painstakingly memorize books about philosophy, he would have discussions with them and try to make the students pose questions, which would give them a deeper understanding of the subject. These views of learning stemmed directly from the writings of Plato. Gemistus had come into contact with them in his early 20s and had apparently been deeply impacted by them. So impacted, in fact, that for the rest of his life, one of Gemistus' main goals would be to revive Plato's philosophy. Although Platonism had been one of the most important philosophies of the ancient world, it had during the Middle Ages been largely replaced by Aristotelianism, which fit more neatly into the Christian worldview, and thus Plato was fairly unknown at the time. In fact, Gemistus' instructor Demetrios Kydonis had only recently managed to obtain a dilapidated copy of Plato's works from the monks at Mount Athos, and only with the help of the Byzantine prince Manuel Palaiologos. When this Manuel later became emperor, he would hold Gemistus in high esteem and employ him as one of the chief advisors and intellectuals of his court. After being sent to the more free-spirited town of Mistra in Morea sometime before 1410, Pletho wrote a number of pamphlets to Manuel with proposed reforms of the empire. These were largely based on Plato's Republic and rejected Justinian's idea of a universal empire in favor of recreating the old Hellenistic civilization. In this system, the army would be made up of professional native Greek soldiers who would be supported by taxpayers exempt from military service. Land was to be publicly owned and a third of all produce given to a state fund. Furthermore, trade was to be regulated and locally available products would be supported over imports. When it came to crime, the punishment of mutilation was to be abolished, but on the other hand, homosexuals were to be burned at the stake. He also supported a centralized monarchy advised by a group of highly educated men as the most stable form of government. Finally, he gave a vague description of what religion ought to be practiced by presenting 3 principles: belief in a supreme being, that this being has concern for mankind, and that it is uninfluenced by gifts or flattery. Needless to say, these reforms were never enacted. However, Gemistus' political views may have served as inspiration for Thomas More's Utopia. The next great undertaking of Pletho was his participation in the Council of Florence, which aimed to unify the Greek and Latin churches. Pletho had been chosen by the new emperor John VIII to accompany his delegation on the basis of his renowned wisdom and morality. But as he was a secular scholar, he was often not needed at the council, and so instead, Pletho set up a temporary school where he lectured Florentine humanists on the difference between Plato and Aristotle. He also wrote down what he taught in a book called De Differentis, which helped greatly to increase the understanding of Plato's philosophy in the West. He also introduced the Italians to the geography of Strabo, which makes Gemistus indirectly responsible for the discovery of America. Columbus did after all cite Strabo as one of his main sources for his theories. After the Byzantine delegation finally returned home after several years in Italy, Pletho's students went on to found a new Platonic academy in Florence with the help of Cosimo de' Medici. Gemistus, on the other hand, went back to Mistra, where he continued to teach philosophy, astronomy, history and geography until his death in probably 1452. And this is where we get to the real interesting stuff. One of the things that Gemistus Pletho left behind him was a book that he'd written himself. He'd only showed it to his closest friends, and now it came into the possession of Princess Theodora, wife of the despot of Morea. Not knowing what to do with it, she asked the Patriarch of Constantinople for advice, and the reply she got was, "Burn it." So what was this book all about? Well, let's just say that Gemistus Pletho wasn't quite such a good and pious Christian as might have seemed. Although the book was eventually burned in 1460, descriptions of its contents in a letter from the Patriarch, as well as Gemistus' own summary, survive, and they speak of a merging of Stoic philosophy, Zoroastrian mysticism, and ancient Greek paganism. In the book, Gemistus recommends religious rites and hymns to petition classical gods like Zeus, Poseidon, and Helios. According to him, they are representations of universal principles and the planetary bodies of our solar system. Furthermore, he rejects the idea of a brief reign of evil, followed by perpetual happiness, and claimed that the universe was perfect, nothing could be added to it, and that it was created beyond time, having no beginning or end. He even believed that the soul, guided by the gods, is forever reincarnated into new bodies in order to fulfill divine order. The book also covered politics, putting forward many of the proposals that he had previously sent to Emperor Manuel, although this time he was more clear on what kind of religion he wanted. One of his enemies would later go on to write of Pletho that "I myself heard him at Florence asserting that in a few more years the whole world would accept one and the same religion, with one mind, one intelligence, one teaching. And when I asked him, Christ's or Mohammed's, he said neither." It was also said that shortly before Gemistus died, he had claimed that not many years after my death, Mohammed and Christ will collapse, and the one truth will shine throughout every region of the globe. So how on earth could he make such big claims when he had barely even shown his writings to anyone? Well, the book that he wrote suggests that metaphysical and social-political truths are the businesses of an enlightened pagan cell rather than of established institutions. And indeed, it is believed that Pletho went underground and founded a pagan brotherhood in Mistra, which he hoped would serve as a vehicle for spiritual and socio-political change. As it turned out though, they weren't quite as successful as Pletho had hoped, but at any rate, it's an interesting story.